The microphone cuts out mid-sentence, and the principal steps in front of her like she never existed. A black student stands frozen on a Christmas stage while the crowd watches her voice get taken away. Teachers look down. Phones come out. No one explains why she's being silenced. They call her speech too much, but refuse to say which words scared them. And what they don't know yet is that this silence is about to cost them everything. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The auditorium had been dressed to feel harmless. Paper snowflakes hung from the ceiling tiles, unevenly cut by hands that had rushed through art class. A plastic pine tree leaned slightly left near the stage, its lights blinking on a tired loop. The choir had just finished, the last note dissolving into applause that felt polite rather than warm. This was supposed to be the moment everyone remembered, the moment the student body president introduced the holiday speaker, the moment a black junior named Alyssa Monroe stepped forward with her folded pages and steady breath, ready to speak to her school about belonging. She reached the microphone before anyone noticed the change. The first sign wasn't visual, it was sonic. The hum that always lived beneath the speakers. An electric whisper no one ever thought about. Cut out. Alyssa tapped the mic once, a reflex, and the sound didn't return. She glanced toward the sound booth, then back to the audience. A few students laughed softly, assuming a technical hiccup. Teachers smiled with the thin patience reserved for assemblies that ran long. Alyssa waited, posture composed, eyes scanning the rows where classmates sat shoulder to shoulder. Some filming already, some whispering, some. Then Principal Daniel Whitaker stepped onto the stage. He didn't rush. He didn't look flustered. He walked with the same practiced calm he used at pep rallies and budget meetings, one hand raised slightly as if to soothe a crowd that hadn't yet realized it needed calming. The applause that met him was automatic, confused, then quickly faded when it became clear he wasn't there to congratulate anyone. He positioned himself between Alyssa and the microphone stand, close enough that she had to take half a step back. The movement was subtle, but the message landed with weight. "There's been a change to the program," he said, voice amplified through a handheld mic that worked perfectly. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone. "We're going to move ahead for now." Alyssa felt the heat rise first in her ears, then her face. She hadn't been told about a change. No one had pulled her aside. No warning, no explanation. Just a sudden erasure performed under stage lights. She tried to speak, to ask a simple question, but Whitaker's shoulder angled slightly, blocking her line to the audience. From the front row, a guidance counselor avoided her eyes. From the third row, her English teacher's mouth fell open, then closed again. "This assembly will continue," Whitaker added, smiling tightly. "Thank you for your understanding." Understanding of what? Alyssa wondered, as her name echoed in her head without being spoken aloud. She stood there for a second too long, long enough for the silence to stretch into discomfort. A few students shifted in their seats. Someone whispered her name. Someone else said, "What's happening?" The snowflakes overhead swayed faintly as the ventilation kicked on, indifferent to the moment hardening below. An assistant principal appeared at the stage steps, gesturing discreetly. Alyssa's legs felt heavy, as if the floor had thickened beneath her shoes. She gathered her pages, hands trembling despite her effort to steady them. The paper felt suddenly fragile, as if the words printed there could tear with one wrong grip. As she turned to leave, she caught a glimpse of the principal's notes. Nothing written about her, just a neat agenda with times crossed out in pen. Backstage wasn't really backstage. It was a narrow strip behind the curtain, where cables coiled and folding chairs leaned against the wall. The holiday music still played faintly through the speakers, as Whitaker handed the microphone back to the announcer and nodded toward the next item on the program. Alyssa stood there, invisible to the audience now, listening as her moment was replaced by a trivia game about winter traditions. Laughter rose again, lighter this time, relief laughter, the kind people used when tension passed without explanation. "What's going on?" she asked, finally finding her voice. Whitaker didn't look at her right away. He adjusted his tie, then lowered his voice. "This isn't the time, Alyssa. I was scheduled," she said. The word sounded small even to her. "You approved the speech." He met her eyes then, and for a split second, something unreadable crossed his face. Calculation, maybe, or irritation at being questioned in a place he considered controlled. "There were concerns," he said. "We'll discuss it later." Concerns. The word landed like a verdict without a trial. Alyssa searched his face for clarification, for any hint of what could possibly be wrong with a holiday speech she had rewritten 3 times. Careful to be hopeful. Careful to be grateful. Careful not to sound angry. She thought of the line she had almost removed, but kept. The one about feeling unseen even in celebrations, meant to include everyone. She wondered if that line had been read aloud in an office somewhere, stripped of context, weighed as a risk. Behind them, the assembly rolled on. A teacher joked into the microphone about ugly sweaters. The audience laughed. Phones went back into pockets. Normalcy resumed with alarming speed. As Alyssa walked down the side aisle toward her seat, every step felt exposed. Heads turned. Some faces showed confusion, others sympathy, a few curiosity sharpened by something colder. She slid into her chair beside her best friend, who leaned in and whispered, "What did you do?" The question wasn't accusatory, but it cut anyway, because it assumed she had done something. "I don't know," Alyssa whispered back, and realized how dangerous that sounded. From the stage, Whitaker's voice rose again, thanking everyone for their flexibility. He didn't mention her name. He didn't acknowledge the interruption. The erasure was complete, efficient, almost elegant. Alyssa sat through the rest of the assembly in a fog, applause washing over her without meaning. Her speech sat folded in her lap, its edges creased now, like it had aged in minutes. What she didn't see, seated where she was the exchange in the back row, a teacher leaning toward another, murmuring something about an email from a parent, about optics, about how this close to break, the school couldn't afford controversy. She didn't hear the word sensitive used as a warning rather than a virtue. She didn't know that earlier that morning her speech had been forwarded, then forwarded again, each time losing a little of its intent, and gaining a little fear. When the bell finally rang and students flooded the aisles, Alyssa remained seated for a beat too long. The decorations looked different now, less festive, more performative. She stood, shoulders squared, and walked toward the exit, past the stage where the microphone stood waiting, live and unused. As she passed Whitaker, he nodded once, a gesture meant to signal closure, but nothing about this felt closed. In the hallway, phones were already out. Questions were already forming. Alyssa felt the shift before she understood it, the sense that whatever had just happened wasn't contained to that room. Someone had noticed the microphone. Someone had noticed who had been silenced, and somewhere between the cut-off hum and the polite applause, a line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. She looked down at her speech one more time, at the opening sentence she never got to read, and wondered which word had scared them enough to stop her. The auditorium emptied in waves, relief rushing out with the noise as if the building itself wanted to forget what had just happened. Holiday music still echoed faintly from the speakers, cheerful and misplaced, clashing with the looks exchanged between students who had witnessed something they didn't yet have language for. Alyssa Monroe walked with the crowd, but not in it, her steps measured, her posture composed in a way that felt practiced now, like muscle memory built from years of needing to appear unbothered. Every few feet she caught fragments of conversation drifting past her, questions sharpened into speculation, sympathy tangled with suspicion. The celebration hadn't ended. It had simply turned, its warmth redirected away from her. Some students spoke her name softly, as if it were fragile. Others didn't speak it at all, choosing instead to glance and look away, their silence louder than curiosity. A boy she barely knew muttered that it was probably a misunderstanding, a phrase that floated through the air repeatedly, as if repetition could turn it into truth. A girl from student council whispered that administration was just being careful, the word careful doing heavy work without anyone examining what it meant. Alyssa felt the shift in how she was being seen, not as the student chosen to speak, but as the variable that had disrupted a smooth program. Suspicion clung to her like static. Teachers lined the exits, smiling too quickly, offering reassurance that sounded rehearsed. One patted Alyssa's shoulder and said, "You know how these things get," without explaining what things were. Another leaned in, voice low, and told her not to take it personally, a suggestion that ignored the fact that it had been deeply, unmistakably personal. The guidance counselor caught up to her near the double doors, mentioning scheduling conflicts and last-minute decisions, language designed to blur responsibility. When Alyssa asked what the concern was, the counselor's smile tightened, and she said, "It's complicated," before gently steering the conversation toward finals week stress and self-care. Outside the auditorium, the hallway buzzed with post-assembly energy that felt distorted, like a song played at the wrong speed. Students clustered around lockers, phones already out, thumbs moving faster than their thoughts. A short video clip began circulating. Just a few seconds of Alyssa at the microphone. The sound cutting, The principal stepping in. Without context, it looked abrupt, uncomfortable. With context, it felt worse. Alyssa didn't know about the clip yet, but she felt its future weight forming, the way moments calcified once they were captured. She reached her locker and opened it slowly, the metal door reflecting her face back at her in fragments. Her best friend hovered nearby, trying to fill the space with normalcy, talking about break plans, about how the assembly had been weird. Alyssa nodded, absorbing the words without anchoring to them. What lingered instead were the looks from earlier, the way a few students had narrowed their eyes, as if searching her for an explanation she hadn't been allowed to give. Celebration had curdled into scrutiny, and she was at its center. Down the hall, a group of parents waited near the main office, coats still on, voices low but urgent. Alyssa passed them without realizing she was the subject of their conversation. One parent said something about not wanting surprises. Another mentioned donors and community image. The word Christmas was used as a shield, as if invoking it could sanctify decisions that felt anything but generous. Inside the office, staff members spoke in clipped tones, glancing toward the door whenever it opened, careful not to say too much where students could hear. By lunchtime, the story had already begun to shift. What started as confusion hardened into narrative, shaped by whoever spoke with the most confidence. Alyssa heard versions of it whispered at tables she passed. That her speech had been political, that it had made someone uncomfortable, that the school was protecting itself. No one seemed to know from what. A rumor surfaced that she had gone off script, another that she'd refused edit. Each version carried the same implication, that the interruption had been necessary, reasonable, responsible. Alyssa sat alone, appetite gone, listening to the room move around her. A teacher approached her table, careful to position her body so it looked like concern rather than interrogation. She asked Alyssa if everything was okay at home, if there was anything going on that might have influenced the speech. The question landed with precision, suggesting instability without naming it. Alyssa answered calmly, saying she was fine, that the speech had been approved. The teacher nodded, but her eyes lingered, searching for something that would justify what had happened. The gaslighting wasn't loud. It was methodical. It lived in phrases like "I'm sure they meant well," and sometimes intent doesn't match impact. It showed up when a staff member suggested Alyssa might have misunderstood the situation, when another implied that stress could make memories unreliable. Each comment chipped away at the clarity of the moment, inviting doubt to replace anger. Alyssa felt the pull of it, the temptation to question her own experience, to smooth the edges so they wouldn't cut anyone else. Late in the afternoon, as classes wound down, a notification buzzed through the student body like a current. A screenshot began circulating, first in small group chats, then wider. It was an email, internal, clearly not meant for students, sent from an administrator to a select group of staff early that morning. Alyssa didn't see it immediately. She sensed the change before the words reached her, the way conversations stopped when she approached, the way faces shifted from curiosity to something closer to alarm. When the screenshot finally landed on her phone, forwarded by someone who didn't add commentary, just a single question mark, Alyssa stared at it until the hallway blurred. The subject line read, "Potential concerns re student speech." The body of the email referenced tone, perception and community sensitivity, and included a line that made her chest tighten. "We should consider whether allowing this student to speak could unintentionally frame the school in a negative light." This student, no name, no acknowledgement of her as a person, just a risk to be managed. The timestamp showed it had been sent hours before the assembly began. Alyssa looked up from her phone, the weight of the day settling into something heavier, more deliberate. What had happened on stage hadn't been spontaneous. It had been planned, discussed, justified in advance. The whispers weren't just gossip. They were echoes of a decision already made, one that had treated her voice as a liability. As the final bell rang, Alyssa stood there, email glowing in her hand, realizing that the silence she'd experienced wasn't accidental. It was procedural. And now that proof was loose, moving through the school faster than anyone could stop it. The stakes were no longer about a cancelled speech. They were about what the administration was afraid of her saying next. The administrative wing of the school felt insulated from the rest of the building, as if sound itself was filtered before it reached those carpeted hallways. While students moved through lockers and lunch lines with restless energy, decisions were being reassembled behind frosted glass, their edges smoothed until they looked reasonable. Alyssa Monroe wasn't present for any of it, but her name traveled the corridors anyway, reduced to a subject line, a concern, a possibility that needed managing. The leaked email had already begun to circulate when Principal Daniel Whitaker closed his office door and took his seat at the head of the conference table, the blinds angled just enough to suggest transparency without allowing it. A handful of administrators gathered with practiced familiarity. Coffee cups were set down carefully, laptops opened. No one raised their voice. That was the first rule of these rooms. Calm equaled control. Whitaker cleared his throat and referred to the agenda, though everyone knew the real topic. He spoke about the assembly in language that softened the act. Adjustments, realignment, timing concerns. When someone mentioned Alyssa by name, he nodded once, acknowledging her existence without granting it gravity. There was a risk assessment, said the assistant principal, careful to frame it as procedural, rather than personal. She referenced the email. The phrase is now under scrutiny. Tone, optics, community sensitivity. Each word carried history, though no one named it. Another administrator chimed in, recalling past incidents when student expression had spiraled, invoking vague memories of backlash without citing specifics. The pattern was familiar, the past used as a warning, never as a lesson. Whitaker leaned back, fingers steepled, listening. When he spoke, his voice was measured. "We have to consider how things land," he said. "Intent doesn't erase impact." The phrase sounded thoughtful, progressive even, and no one challenged it. What went unspoken was whose impact mattered. A counselor mentioned that Alyssa's speech had been approved, that it had gone through revisions. Whitaker acknowledged this with a slight tilt of his head, then reframed it as a breakdown in communication. Approval, he suggested, wasn't the same as endorsement under changing circumstances. Selective enforcement slipped in quietly. Someone brought up a speech from the previous year, one that had touched on national tragedy and resilience, delivered by a white senior who'd received a standing ovation. The comparison hung in the air for a moment, before being dismissed as different context. Context, it seemed, was flexible. What counted as inspiring for one student could be construed as provocative for another, depending on how closely it mirrored the school's comfort zone. Respectability politics did the rest of the work. A teacher commented that Alyssa was bright, articulate, but still young, a description that sounded benign until paired with concern about how her words might be interpreted beyond the room. Another added that students sometimes didn't understand how their experiences could be misread, suggesting that responsibility lay not with the listeners but with the speaker to anticipate discomfort. Whitaker nodded again, this time more firmly. He spoke about protecting students from consequences they couldn't foresee, casting the intervention as benevolence. But none of them discussed directly was the image of a black student naming exclusion during a Christmas assembly, how that might reverberate beyond the walls of the school. The fear sat there anyway, unaddressed but central. It shaped the conversation, guided the conclusion. When Whitaker summarized the decision, he emphasized balance, neutrality, the importance of unity during the holidays. Unity, in this framing, required silence. A knock at the door interrupted them briefly. A secretary slipped in to whisper about calls coming in, parents asking questions. Whitaker's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He dismissed the group with assurances that a statement would be drafted, something careful, something that reaffirmed values without admitting fault. As the others filed out, he remained seated, staring at the anging until the words blurred. Later in a smaller meeting, Whitaker spoke with the district liaison over speakerphone. The tone shifted then, less abstract, more candid. He explained the situation in concise terms, highlighting the proactive nature of the decision. The liaison asked whether the content had been inflammatory. Whitaker paused before answering, choosing his words with precision. Not explicitly, he said, but perception is everything. When the call ended, Whitaker stood and walked to the window, adjusting the blinds to look out at the parking lot. Students were leaving for the day, backpacks slung low, laughter spilling out despite the tension that lingered. He exhaled slowly, the weight of leadership settling into something like irritation. He hadn't anticipated the screenshot leaking. That had complicated things. Containment was always easier when narratives stayed internal. Across the building, Alyssa sat in the library, phone buzzing intermittently, as more messages came in. She wasn't part of the meetings, but she felt their consequences pressing in. Her guidance counselor eventually found her, speaking softly about scheduling a conversation, about letting things cool down. Alyssa listened, nodding, absorbing the implication that time would dull the harm. When she asked whether the administration would acknowledge the email, the counselor hesitated, then said it was being handled. Handled. The word echoed Whitaker's earlier language, the same vocabulary used to minimize, to smooth over. Alyssa thanked her and returned to her work, though her eyes traced the same line over and over, without meaning. She sensed that whatever fairness meant in this system, it wasn't designed with her in mind. As evening approached, Whitaker drafted the statement himself. He removed adjectives, added qualifiers, ensured it sounded empathetic without conceding error. He referenced inclusivity, respect, the school's commitment to dialogue. He avoided Alyssa's name. Before sending it, he reread the leaked email, now aware it was circulating beyond his control. For the first time that day, something like doubt flickered. Not about the decision, but about its aftermath. He picked up his phone and typed a brief message to the district office, outlining next steps, contingency plans. At the end, almost as an aside, he added a single sentence that revealed more than he intended. We need to prevent this from turning into something bigger than the school. He stared at the screen before hitting send, knowing even as he did that it already had. The phrase arrived quietly, slipping into conversations as if it had always belonged there. Too much. It appeared first in emails that were never meant to be public, then in hallway reassurances offered with sympathetic eyes. It was said gently, like advice, like concern, like a warning delivered for Alyssa Monroe's own good. No one could point to a single sentence in her speech that crossed a line, but the label clung anyway, shaping perception faster than evidence ever could. By the next morning, the school had accepted it as truth without ever needing to hear her words. Alyssa learned about the label through omission. She requested a meeting to discuss the decision, and the response came back framed in caution. Administrators praised her thoughtfulness, her maturity, her potential, and then pivoted to the need for balance. They talked about the holidays as a sensitive time, about keeping the focus on joy, about how messages could land differently depending on audience. Each sentence sounded reasonable, in isolation. Together they formed a case against her voice, recasting it as an object that needed regulating. In one meeting, a vice principal explained that the concern wasn't what Alyssa meant to say, but how it might be received. You have to understand, she said, folding her hands on the desk. People bring their own experiences into the room. Alyssa listened, jaw tight, as responsibility was subtly reassigned. The burden shifted from listeners to the speaker, from interpretation to intention. When Alyssa asked which part of the speech was problematic, the answer circled back to tone. Not angry, exactly. Not inappropriate, just heavy, just too much for a festive assembly. The word carried history, though no one named it. It echoed every time Black expression had been framed as excessive, too loud, too emotional, too political, no matter how carefully measured. Alyssa thought of the edits she had already made, the lines she had softened, the metaphors she had removed because they felt risky. She had chosen hope over indictment, gratitude over grievance. Still, the speech had been deemed dangerous, its potential impact inflated until it eclipsed its actual content. Behind closed doors, the rewriting began. Not on paper, but in narrative. Staff members summarized her speech for those who hadn't read it, emphasizing imagined reactions rather than real sentences. One described it as intense. Another suggested it might make some families uncomfortable. By the time it reached a broader audience, the speech had become a specter, undefined but ominous. The absence of specifics made it easier to fear. The lack of transparency became the justification. Alyssa felt the distortion most acutely when teachers spoke to her as if she needed guidance. One pulled her aside after class and suggested that sometimes it was better to ease people into conversations. Another recommended she save certain topics for college, where there was more room for nuance. The implication was clear. This wasn't the right place, the right time, the right audience. The rightness of her perspective was never questioned outright. It was simply deferred indefinitely. At home, Alyssa spread the pages of her speech across her bed, rereading them with a new lens. She tried to see what they saw, to locate the threat everyone seemed to sense. The words hadn't changed, but their weight had. A paragraph about belonging now felt charged. A line about visibility suddenly radical. She wondered how something so carefully constructed could be transformed so completely by people who had only glanced at it. The criminalization wasn't of content, she realized, but of presence, the audacity of speaking plainly about being unseen. Meanwhile, the administration's public messaging continued to emphasize care. A statement circulated reaffirming the school's commitment to inclusion and respect. It mentioned the importance of maintaining a welcoming environment for all students. It did not mention Alyssa. It did not acknowledge the email. It did not explain why a student had been silenced mid-assembly. The omission functioned as erasure, and it worked. Without details, speculation filled the gap, and speculation tended to favor authority. Students debated the issue in fragments, their understanding shaped by what they'd been told, rather than what they'd witnessed. Some argued that the school had the right to intervene. Others questioned why intervention had been necessary at all. Alyssa listened from the edges, her name invoked without her participation. She became a symbol in an argument she hadn't started, her actual voice replaced by interpretations stacked atop one another like a game of telephone. An unexpected twist surfaced when a drama teacher, who had quietly requested to see the speech weeks earlier, reached out to Alyssa. He admitted he'd read it in full. He told her, carefully, that there was nothing incendiary in it, nothing that justified the reaction. It's reflective, he said. It asks people to consider themselves. He paused, then added, that's what scared them. The honesty startled Alyssa more than the support. It was the first time someone named the distortion outright. Word of his assessment spread quietly, unsettling the official narrative. If the speech wasn't inflammatory, then what had driven the decision? The answer hovered unspoken, uncomfortable. It suggested that the threat lay not in what Alyssa said, but in what it might make others feel. Seen, implicated, questioned. The moral distortion was complete. A call for recognition reframed as an attack. Vulnerability recast as provocation. As pressure mounted, Whitaker doubled down on discretion. He reiterated to staff that sharing the speech would only complicate matters, that context could be misconstrued, that emotions were running high. He framed restraint as leadership, silence as protection. The irony went unacknowledged. Each attempt to control the narrative only sharpened curiosity, only made the unseen words loom larger. Alyssa sensed the shift. The more the administration insisted the speech was inappropriate, the more people wanted to read it. She received messages asking for copies, screenshots, anything. She hesitated, torn between the desire to be understood and the fear of further consequences. The speech, once meant for a single moment, had become leverage. Its unseen status granted it power. Late one night, Alyssa sat at her desk, the pages gathered neatly, edges smooth. She thought about the label that had followed her through the halls. The way too much had been used to shrink her, to caution her into quiet. She realized then that withholding the speech had allowed others to define it. Silence had not protected her. It had exposed her. Her phone buzzed with a new message from an unknown number, brief and direct. If people could read it, everything would change. Alyssa stared at the screen, heart racing, understanding the risk and the possibility intertwined. Somewhere between restraint and revelation, a decision waited to be made, and the words everyone feared remained just out of reach, unseen but pressing, ready to surface. By the next school day, the hallways had learned a new choreography. Students moved with intention now, glancing up just long enough to register who was watching, and who wasn't. Alyssa Munro felt it the moment she stepped through the doors. The shift in air, the way conversations thinned as she passed, the sudden interest in lockers and phones that flared whenever her shadow crossed a wall. Nothing had been announced, no rule had been posted, and yet a choice was being made in real time, one look at a time. Some faces softened when they saw her, brows knitting in quiet solidarity. Others tightened, as if bracing for association. Alyssa understood the calculus without anyone explaining it. To be seen with her now meant something. It invited questions. It risked attention. The administration hadn't named a consequence, but the fear of one hovered close enough to shape behavior. Silence became currency, neutrality a shield. People who had once waved, now nodded vaguely, eyes already moving on. Phones were everywhere, but they were quiet. Screens glowed at waist level, thumbs hovering without tapping. Group chats hummed without names attached, messages forwarded and deleted in quick succession. Alyssa knew her speech was still unseen, but its absence had become louder than any paragraph. Rumors sharpened around the edges, turning into positions. A few students repeated the administration's language, almost verbatim, talking about timing and appropriateness, insisting the school was just trying to keep things calm. Others countered with questions that didn't land anywhere, asking why calm required cutting a microphone. At lunch, the room split subtly. Tables that once overlapped in easy ways now felt defined by who sat where. Alyssa took a seat near the windows, back straight, expression neutral. Across the room, a cluster of students glanced over, then back to one another. Voices lowered. She caught pieces of it. Concern about colleges, about recommendations, about being labeled difficult. The fear wasn't abstract. It was practical, measured in futures and files. Alyssa didn't blame them. She just noted the cost. A few seats away, a sophomore named Marcus Hale watched the room instead of his tray. He hadn't spoken to Alyssa much before, but he'd noticed the way adults spoke around her now. The careful phrasing, the gentle warnings disguised as advice. He'd noticed how quickly the narrative had hardened without evidence. Marcus kept his phone face down, listening. He had grown up learning when to keep his head down, when to observe instead of intervene. But something about this moment felt familiar in an uncomfortable way, like watching a door close slowly while everyone pretended not to see it. Teachers moved through the space with an air of vigilance. One reminded students to keep discussions respectful. Another suggested focusing on finals. The message was clear: move on. The suggestion carried an unspoken judgment, implying that lingering discomfort was indulgent, that justice had an expiration date. Alyssa felt the pressure to comply, to make herself small enough that the hallway could relax again. Between classes, a counselor stopped her and asked if she was doing okay. The question loaded with expectation. When Alyssa said she was fine, the counselor smiled with relief, as if that settled it. Fine meant manageable. Fine meant quiet. As Alyssa walked away, she realized how often she had been coached toward that word, how it functioned as a social off switch. The choosing of sides wasn't always dramatic. It showed up in who reposted the school's statement without comment, and who didn't. It showed up in a student newspaper draft that mentioned the assembly without naming her. It showed up in the absence of names on a sign-up sheet for an open forum that had been proposed, then quietly cancelled due to low interest. Resistance existed, but it was cautious, whispered, fragmented. No one wanted to be first. In the hallway outside the administrative offices, a small group of students paused longer than necessary, pretending to check schedules. The door was ajar. Voices inside low but audible. A staff member was speaking about damage control, about parents calling, about keeping the narrative consistent. Another voice, recognizable, firm, responded that consistency mattered more than speed. The door closed. The students exchanged looks, the kind that carried meaning without agreement. That afternoon, a class discussion veered unexpectedly. A teacher referenced freedom of expression in a general sense, framing it as a balancing act. Alyssa listened, hands folded, as classmates spoke around her. One said rules were rules. Another said context mattered. A third asked who got to decide. The teacher nodded at all of it, careful not to land anywhere. The neutrality felt like abandonment. Alyssa realized then that being present in the room didn't guarantee being included in the conversation. After the bell, Marcus lingered near the lockers across from Alyssa's, pretending to adjust his bag. He had been thinking all day about the overheard conversations, about the email screenshot he'd seen, about how easily the story had been bent. He noticed the security camera mounted above the hallway, its red light blinking steadily. He noticed the way administrators lowered their voices when they passed. He felt the weight of choosing, heavy and immediate. When Alyssa closed her locker, Marcus caught her eye. He hesitated, then nodded once, a small gesture that said more than words. She returned it, surprised by the steadiness it gave her. Not everyone had turned away. Not everyone needed permission to see what was happening. Later, as students filtered out, Marcus found himself near the administrative wing again. The building quieted, footsteps echoing less frequently. An office door stood partially open, light spilling into the hallway. Inside, Whitaker's voice carried, sharper than usual, speaking to someone unseen. He was talking about escalation, about how certain actions could force responses the school wasn't prepared for. Marcus slowed, heart pounding, phone already in his hand. He didn't plan it. He didn't frame the shot. He simply raised the phone slightly. Screen dark, recording without sound cues. Whitaker's voice continued, measured but tense, referencing the situation as a lesson, warning that letting things spiral could invite scrutiny beyond the district. The words weren't dramatic, but they were revealing. They named fear where leadership had claimed care. Marcus lowered the phone, breath shallow, understanding the gravity of what he'd captured. He slipped the device into his pocket and walked away, pulse loud in his ears. Behind him, the office door closed, sealing the conversation back inside. Ahead of him, the hallway stretched long and bright, a corridor of choices narrowing fast. By the time Alyssa stepped outside into the cold afternoon air, the school felt different, not quieter but charged. Sides had been chosen, even by those who claimed neutrality. And somewhere in a student's pocket, A recording existed that could fracture the careful calm the administration had built, if anyone was brave enough to let it be heard. By the time the school day ended, the administration's version of events had already begun to multiply. It didn't arrive as a single announcement, but as a series of carefully tailored explanations, each adjusted for its audience, each emphasizing a different truth. Parents received emails first, measured, reassuring, deliberately vague. The message spoke of an unexpected adjustment to the assembly program, framed as a decision made in the interest of maintaining a positive environment. It emphasized student well-being, mutual respect, and the importance of unity during the holidays. Nowhere did it mention a microphone being cut. Nowhere did it name Alyssa Monroe. Phones buzzed across kitchens and living rooms as parents read the message, some skimming, others reading closely. For many, the explanation was enough. Schools made decisions all the time, and this one sounded reasonable, almost dual. But for others, the lack of detail felt intentional. Questions surfaced quietly at first, texts sent between parents who knew one another, who had children in the same classes, who had seen the short video clips circulating earlier that afternoon. The email didn't match what they'd seen. That discrepancy lodged itself uncomfortably. As calls came in, Principal Daniel Whitaker adjusted again. On the phone with one parent, he emphasized timing, explaining that the assembly had run long and adjustments were necessary. With another, he stressed sensitivity, noting that certain themes required careful handling in mixed audiences. In a third conversation, he leaned into policy, referencing guidelines about student speeches and administrative discretion. Each explanation sounded complete on its own. Together they formed a mosaic that didn't quite align. In one household, Alyssa's parents sat side by side at the kitchen table. The email opened between them. Her mother read it twice, then a third time, each pass sharpening her concern. The language felt familiar, the kind that smoothed over sharp edges without acknowledging them. Alyssa's father listened as she recounted what had happened, her voice steady but strained. When she mentioned the leaked email, his expression changed, something hardening behind his eyes. The school's message, so careful in its phrasing, now read like a deliberate omission. Across town, another parent forwarded the email to a group chat titled School Updates, adding a single line, "Does this sound right to anyone?" Responses trickled in, cautious at first. One parent said the school probably knew best. Another asked what the speech had been about. Someone else mentioned hearing that it was political, though they couldn't say how. The uncertainty created space for assumptions to grow, each one nudged by the administration's refusal to be specific. Whitaker fielded a call from a longtime donor that evening. His tone shifting subtly, he reassured them that the situation was under control, that the school's values remained intact. He framed the incident as a misunderstanding magnified by social media. Something that would pass if handled calmly. Reputation hovered beneath every sentence, unspoken but central. He understood that parents weren't just listening for facts. They were listening for assurance that the institution they trusted hadn't failed. The racial double standard emerged not through explicit statements, but through contrast. Parents recalled past assemblies where student speakers had touched on grief, national tragedy, even political moments, and those speeches had been celebrated as courageous. No emails had been sent then, no justifications offered. The difference this time sat heavy, even if it wasn't named. Some parents felt it instinctively, an unease they couldn't quite articulate without sounding accusatory. Alyssa's name began appearing in conversations more openly now, attached to questions rather than assumptions. A few parents asked directly what she had planned to say. The administration's responses remained evasive. They spoke about potential impact instead of actual content, about the need to protect all students. Protection became the catch-all defense, shielding the decision from scrutiny while implying that scrutiny itself was a threat. And an unexpected twist came when two parents compared notes and realized they'd been told entirely different things. One had been assured the speech was pulled due to time constraints. Another had been told it was content-related. The inconsistency sparked something sharper than confusion. It sparked suspicion. Screenshots of emails and text summaries began circulating in parent groups. The discrepancies laid bare. The narrative, once controlled, started to fracture. At a small gathering that evening, parents lingered after a booster club meeting, voices low but urgent. Someone mentioned the leaked email. Someone else asked whether the school had the right to silence a student mid-speech. A mother who rarely spoke up said quietly that her daughter had come home upset, feeling like something unfair had happened. The room grew still. The incident was no longer abstract. it had entered their home. Whitaker drafted a follow-up message late that night, revising sentences repeatedly. He wanted to clarify without conceding. He wanted to reassure without explaining too much. The balance grew harder to maintain. As questions sharpened, he removed a line acknowledging the disruption, worried it might sound like an admission. He added language about dialogue, hoping it would placate without inviting debate. Before sending it, he paused, aware that every word now carried risk. The next morning, parents gathered outside the school for drop-off, conversations overlapping. Some nodded politely at administrators, others avoided eye contact. Alyssa's mother stood near the entrance, listening as snippets floated by, mentions of emails, of fairness, of optics. When Whitaker approached her with a practiced smile, she met it evenly, asking when the school planned to address the inconsistencies. He offered to schedule a meeting, his tone calm, but the answer didn't satisfy her. The delay felt strategic. Word spread that a parent had requested to speak at the upcoming school board meeting. The agenda hadn't been released yet, but the rumor carried weight. Parents wondered who it was, what they planned to say. The administration moved quickly, advising caution, reminding families of procedures and appropriate channels. The emphasis on process felt like another attempt to slow momentum. That afternoon, Whitaker received an email from a parent he didn't recognize. Subject line stark, request for clarification. The message was concise, respectful, and pointed. It referenced the assembly, the leaked email, and the differing explanations parents had received. It asked a single question: can you explain why a student was silenced without explanation, and why the reason for that silence keeps changing? He stared at the screen longer than he meant to. The question stripped away the layers he'd built, leaving the core exposed. There was no easy answer that didn't reveal fear. Fear of backlash, fear of scrutiny, fear of losing control of the story. By evening, confirmation arrived that the parent intended to speak publicly, not privately, and that others planned to attend. The school's justification, once dispersed quietly through emails and phone calls, was about to be tested in the open. Whitaker closed his laptop, the hum of the building settling around him, knowing that the next explanation he gave wouldn't be tailored to a single listener, and that someone was finally going to ask the question he'd worked hardest to avoid. The night before the board meeting, the school felt like a place holding its breath. Hallways were quiet after hours, but the tension still seemed to cling to the walls, as if the building remembered the sound of a microphone dying mid-sentence. Alyssa Monroe sat at her bedroom desk with the lamp angled low, the pages of her speech spread out in front of her like evidence. Her parents moved around the house carefully, trying not to push too hard, trying not to speak too loudly. The silence wasn't comfort, it was anticipation. Outside her window, neighbors' Christmas lights blinked on and off in rehearsed cheer, and Alyssa couldn't stop thinking about how easy it was for warmth to become a performance when it wasn't meant for everyone. Her phone buzzed again. Another message asking for the speech. Another request to just show people so they could stop assuming. Alyssa had resisted all day, partly because she didn't want her words twisted again, and partly because she'd been conditioned to believe that protecting herself meant staying controlled. But control was already gone. The administration had taken her voice and replaced it with a rumor shaped to fit their comfort. People were arguing about her intentions without ever reading her sentences. She stared at the top page where her name sat neatly typed, the title under it simple and careful, A Christmas Wish for Belonging. Even the title sounded harmless. That was the part that felt almost unbearable. The fact that she had already tried to make herself palatable, and it still wasn't enough. Alyssa's mother knocked softly and stepped into the room, carrying 2 mugs of tea that neither of them really wanted. She placed one on the desk and looked at the pages, then at Alyssa. "They're going to make you sound like something you're not," she said, voice steady but tired. "That's what people do when they don't want to deal with the truth." Alyssa's throat tightened. "What if it makes it worse?" she asked, and hated how small the question sounded. Worse didn't just mean gossip. Worse meant retaliation, wrapped in policy. Worse meant teachers looking through her instead of at her. Worse meant being treated like a risk for the rest of the year. Her father appeared behind her mother, arms folded, jaw set. "It's already worse," he said quietly, "because right now, they get to define you." Alyssa looked down at the pages again. The words suddenly less like a speech, and more like a line she had to decide whether to cross. She wasn't angry in the way people expected anger to look. She was exhausted. Exhausted from being careful, from editing herself into something softer, from still being treated like she'd brought a weapon to a holiday assembly. The school had labeled her voice too much without ever letting it exist. A draft that was never dangerous had been criminalized by assumption alone. Down the street, Marcus Hale sat on his bed with his phone in his hand. The recording he'd made still unopened, still untouched like contraband. He had listened to it once, headphones on, heart pounding, and the words had stuck to him. Whitaker hadn't used slurs. He hadn't shouted. But he had said enough. Enough to reveal the mindset behind the calm. "We need to prevent this from turning into something bigger," the principal had insisted, his voice tense in the recording. Bigger than the school. Bigger than control. Marcus understood why that sentence mattered. It wasn't about protecting students. It was about protecting the institution from being seen. Marcus had wanted to send it to someone immediately. But fear stopped him. Fear of being punished. Fear of becoming the next target. Fear of people saying he'd taken it out of context. Still, the recording sat there, proof that the administration's concern wasn't Alyssa's well-being. It was backlash. His phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. "Do you have it?" Marcus stared, pulse rising. Another message followed. "The speech. People are asking. If it's out, everything changes." He didn't respond. He didn't know who it was. But he knew what it meant. The school was at the edge of something. And everyone could feel it. The more the adults tried to contain it, the more it pressed outward. Back in Alyssa's room, she made the decision with hands that shook less than she expected. She opened her laptop and typed the speech out cleanly into a document, formatting it carefully, as if presentation could protect it from distortion. She read through it one last time, not as a student trying to please a committee, but as a person measuring the truth of her own words. The speech spoke about Christmas as a season of recognition, about the longing to be seen without having to perform. It mentioned how some students moved through the halls, as if they belonged automatically, while others learned to earn acceptance through silence. It didn't accuse. It didn't name individuals. It asked for empathy, for noticing, for the kind of care that wasn't selective. There was a paragraph that made her breathe slowly before continuing. It wasn't harsh, but it was honest. It described what it felt like to watch the school celebrate together while still feeling like an outsider in the very place that claimed to be home. It described the small ways exclusion happened, how teachers mispronounced names and never corrected themselves, how security followed certain students more closely, how good fit was spoken like a code. Alyssa had written it gently, almost like confession, and yet she could already hear how adults would interpret it. Divisive, inappropriate, too much. Her mother watched her finish, then placed her hand briefly on Alyssa's shoulder. "This is not a threat," she said, as if naming it out loud could dissolve the lie. "This is a mirror. And people hate mirrors when they show them something they don't want to see." Alyssa saved the file and hesitated one last time, then sent it to 3 people she trusted. Her best friend, the drama teacher who had said it scared them because it asked people to consider themselves, and a student council acquaintance who had seemed uneasy about the cancellation. She added no explanation, just the document. The act felt both small and enormous, like dropping a single match into a dry field. She didn't post it publicly. She didn't attach a caption. She simply let it exist outside her hands for the first time. Within minutes, her best friend responded with a message that didn't try to soften anything. "This is beautiful. They stopped you for this." The disbelief was immediate, and it came with something else, anger on Alyssa's behalf. Clear and unfiltered. A second message arrived from the drama teacher, short and heavy. "You were never the problem." Then the student council acquaintance replied with a single sentence that made Alyssa's stomach drop. "People need to see this before tomorrow. I'm sending it to a few others." Alyssa typed back fast, telling her to be careful, to ask first, to keep it controlled. But controlled was a fantasy now. The document had left her screen, and she could almost feel it moving, copied and forwarded, multiplied in ways she couldn't track. A quiet circulation began, not dramatic, not public yet, but steady. It slid into group chats and DMs. It appeared in screenshots and shared drives. Students read it between classes, in bathrooms, under desks, in the corners of cafeterias. Each new reader added a reaction, a comment, a question that pushed the speech further outward. The most dangerous part wasn't the content. It was the contrast. People had expected something provocative because they'd been told to expect it. Instead, they found warmth, clarity, and a restrained honesty that made the cancellation look grotesque. The draft that was never dangerous exposed the moral distortion the administration had relied on. The more students read it, the less plausible the official story became. In the administrative office, the next morning, Whitaker sat with his assistant principal, reviewing notes for the board meeting, when her phone buzzed. She glanced down, face tightening. Another buzz. Another. She looked up slowly. It's circulating, she said. Whitaker frowned. What is? She slid her phone across the desk. On the screen was a screenshot of Alyssa's speech. The opening paragraphs visible. Her name at the top. Whitaker read quickly, jaw tightening further with each line. Not because the speech was inflammatory, but because it was undeniable. It made the school's decision look exactly like what critics would call it. Silencing. Whitaker pushed the phone back, voice clipped. Who released it? The assistant principal hesitated. Students. It's moving fast. Whitaker stood, pacing once, then stopped. His calm was strained now, as if he could feel the institution's image slipping. If this gets outside the school, he said half to himself, we lose control completely. At the same moment, Marcus sat in his first period class watching messages flood his phone. People reacting to the speech, quoting lines, asking how the school could justify what it had done. He stared at the recording on his device again, the one sentence from Whitaker echoing, bigger than the school. Marcus understood then that the speech wasn't the only thing that could change everything. If the words were already igniting empathy, the recording could ignite He slipped the phone into his pocket, feeling the weight of it like a secret that wouldn't stay quiet much longer, while the school unknowingly marched toward a day it could no longer manage. It didn't explode all at once. It seeped. What began as quiet circulation hardened into momentum, the moment the speech left the school's internal gravity. By second period, students weren't just reading Alyssa Monroe's words, they were reacting to them, contextualizing them against the video clip of the silenced microphone, against the emails that had tried to sound calm while concealing fear. Screens lit up in lockers and bathrooms, in the backs of classrooms, where teachers spoke about unrelated things. The contrast was devastating. The speech asked for belonging. The school had responded with removal. The gap between the two became the story. A hashtag appeared without coordination. A simple phrase lifted from Alyssa's opening line. It spread because it didn't accuse. It invited. Posts paired screenshots of the speech with still frames from the assembly video. Captions asking how something so careful could be deemed dangerous. Alumni chimed in first. Then students from neighboring schools. The algorithm did what it always did when injustice became legible. It amplified. By lunchtime, the story had leapt beyond lockers and hallways into timelines and feeds, stitched together by outrage that didn't need instruction. Alyssa learned about it when her phone refused to stop vibrating. Notifications stacked faster than she could read them. Messages ranged from gratitude to disbelief, to apology. People told her they saw themselves in her words, that they wished they'd had language like hers when they were students. Others asked if she was safe, if the school was retaliating. Alyssa sat in the nurse's office, not sick but unsteady, trying to breathe through the sensation that her private thoughts had become public property. She hadn't gone live. She hadn't posted anything herself, and yet she was suddenly everywhere. Teachers noticed the shift immediately. Students weren't whispering anymore. They were showing one another screens openly. A history teacher paused mid-lecture when she saw her class scrolling in unison. An administrator attempted to confiscate a phone and was met with calm resistance. A student pointing out that there was no rule against reading. The usual levers, authority, policy, routine, failed to slow the spread. Information moved faster than instruction. In the main office, phones rang without pause. Parents demanded explanations that no longer satisfied. Reporters left messages requesting comment. The district office called twice in an hour, asking for updates that Whitaker didn't have. The assistant principal refreshed her browser and watched the school's name climb trending lists. It had never approached before. Each mention peeled away another layer of control. The narrative had collapsed not because it was attacked, but because it couldn't withstand comparison. An unexpected turn came when a local journalist posted a thread breaking down the timeline, approval of the speech, last-minute cancellation, the leaked email, the content of the draft. The tone was restrained, almost clinical, which made it more damning. Facts aligned themselves. Screenshots became receipts. The journalist ended the thread with a question that spread like gasoline. If this speech was too much, what does that say about the environment it was meant for? Whitaker convened an emergency meeting. Faces around the table looked different now. Less composed, more urgent. Someone suggested shutting down comments on the school's social media pages. Someone else proposed issuing a stronger statement. Another argued for silence, hoping the cycle would move on. Whitaker listened, jaw tight. As the options dwindled, the speech itself had become a moral document, its empathy exposing the institution's fear. There was no framing that could reverse that. Across the building, Marcus Hale sat in a stairwell, watching the wave crest. Messages poured in asking if he'd heard the recording, if it was real, if it existed. He hadn't shared it yet. He hadn't needed to. The speech had done the work on its own. Still, he felt the pressure building, a sense that the story was incomplete without proof of intent. He replayed Whitaker's sentence in his head, prevent this from turning into something bigger, and realized the irony was total. The attempt to contain had guaranteed expansion. Alyssa was called into the office late in the afternoon. The tone had changed. Administrators spoke about concern for her well-being, about online attention, about safety. They suggested she take a day off, maybe two, to let things cool down. The language was soft, almost caring, but the implication was familiar. Step aside, make space, don't escalate. Alyssa listened, eyes steady, and asked whether the school planned to address why her speech had been stopped. The answer circled again: complexity, timing, miscommunication, the same words, now hollow. When she left the office, she passed a group of students gathered around a phone, watching a live stream from a local news outlet discussing the situation. Her name appeared on the screen, beneath a still image from the assembly. She felt the ground tilt slightly. The story had outgrown the building. It was no longer something the school could shepherd through internal channels. That evening, the school's servers strained under traffic. The website slowed, then briefly went down. Emails bounced. Parents refreshed inboxes. The district sent a directive requesting immediate coordination on messaging. Whitaker sat alone in his office, tie loosened, staring at the screen, where the speech glowed, lines highlighted by thousands of readers. He understood now that the problem wasn't backlash, it was credibility. The institution had bet on silence and law. His phone rang. The caller ID showed a district number he didn't recognize. He answered, listening as a voice on the other end spoke quickly, urgently, about risk management, about exposure, about the need to pause all non-essential activities. The phrase came plainly, stripped of euphemism: we need to shut this down before it spreads any further. Whitaker closed his eyes, the weight of the moment settling. Outside his office, students moved through the halls with purpose. Phones held high, the truth no longer confined. Somewhere between lockers and live streams, control had slipped away, and the call to contain it had arrived too late. The school looked the same on the surface, but everything underneath had shifted. Paper wreaths still clung to classroom doors, and a banner wishing everyone happy holidays stretched across the main hallway, its cheerful letters now feeling almost accusatory. Students passed beneath it with phones in hand, not hiding them anymore, screens glowing with headlines and clips and screenshots that refused to stay contained. The decorations hadn't changed, but their meaning had. What once signaled warmth now felt like camouflage. Inside the administrative suite, emergency meetings overlapped each other, calendars collapsing into a blur of back-to-back decisions that didn't feel like decisions at all. Principal Daniel Whitaker sat at the center of it, jacket draped over the back of his chair, the room buzzing with quiet urgency. District representatives appeared on screens, their faces flattened by video calls, speaking in measured tones that barely concealed alarm. Words like exposure, liability, and narrative were repeated often enough to feel ritualistic. The focus wasn't on Alyssa Monroe anymore. It was on containment. Someone suggested accelerating plans for the school's diversity initiative announcement, originally scheduled for spring. Another proposed highlighting past assemblies that celebrated inclusion, compiling photos and quotes that could be pushed out quickly. Performative inclusion took shape in real time, not as belief, but as strategy. A communications consultant advised leaning into language about listening and learning, while carefully avoiding any admission of wrongdoing. Apologies, they warned, created precedent. Whitaker nodded through it all, the hypocrisy pressing in, even as he participated. The same administration that had deemed Alyssa's words too risky now scrambled to display values her speech had embodied without permission. Posters were hastily designed. A draft email circulated with subject lines tested for tone. Moving forward together, our commitment to community. Each version sounded sincere enough to someone unfamiliar with the timeline. Down the hall, teachers were pulled into briefings, instructed on how to respond if students asked questions. The guidance was vague by design. Emphasize care, avoid specifics, redirect concerns to administration. One teacher asked whether Alyssa would be allowed to speak now. The question hung in the room longer than expected, before someone answered that the situation was under review. Review had become a holding pattern, a way to delay without refusing outright. Alyssa watched all of this from the periphery, the way one watched a storm gather while being told it was only cloudy. She'd been advised to stay home for the day for her own well-being, a suggestion framed as kindness but heavy with implication. Instead, she came to school anyway, walking past the decorations with her head high, refusing to disappear quietly. Students noticed. Some smiled in encouragement. Others simply watched, as if witnessing a test of endurance. Her presence complicated the narrative. It was harder to talk about her in abstract terms when she was right there, breathing, existing beyond the controversy assigned to her. A counselor intercepted her near the library, gently reminding her that things were very sensitive right now. Alyssa replied evenly, that they had been sensitive when her microphone was cut, too. The counselor had no response ready for that. In classrooms, discussions veered off script despite attempts to keep them contained. Students referenced the situation indirectly, talking about freedom of expression, about whose voices were deemed disruptive. Teachers shifted uncomfortably, some trying to steer back to curriculum, others allowing the conversation to breathe despite the risk. The building pulsed with attention that couldn't be emailed away. Meanwhile, Whitaker's inbox filled faster than he could read. Community members weighed in. Alumni wrote long messages recounting similar experiences from years earlier, connecting dots the administration had hoped would remain isolated. A local advocacy group requested a meeting. The district asked for a formal report. Each message chipped away at the illusion that this could be handled quietly. The fear of exposure sharpened when a reporter requested on-camera comment during school hours. Whitaker declined, citing student privacy, but the refusal only fueled speculation. The optics were slipping. Every move to control the story seemed to confirm it. The school's attempt to project calm now read as avoidance. An unexpected twist emerged from the place Whitaker least anticipated. The students themselves. A group of seniors submitted a formal request to use the auditorium during lunch for a listening space. The language was careful, echoing the administration's own phrasing back at it. They emphasized dialogue, community, and shared values. The request followed procedure perfectly, leaving little room for outright denial without contradiction. The assistant principal brought the request into the emergency meeting, her expression tight. "They want to host it tomorrow," she said. "They're calling it a student-led forum." Whitaker leaned forward. "On what topic?" She hesitated. "Voices and belonging." The room went quiet. Everyone understood what it meant, without it being said. A forum meant questions. Questions meant answers. Answers meant losing control of the timeline. Someone suggested postponing due to safety concerns. Another warned that denying it outright would escalate things further. The irony was thick. The administration had insisted on dialogue in its statements, and now dialogue was being demanded. Outside the office, the decorations fluttered slightly as the ventilation kicked on, their glitter catching the fluorescent lights. Students gathered in clusters, talking openly now about what should happen next. Some wanted Alyssa to read her speech publicly. Others argued for accountability from the administration. The energy had shifted from outrage to intention. This wasn't just about reacting anymore. It was about deciding. Alyssa learned about the request through a friend who found her near the windows. "They're asking for a forum," she said, voice low but excited. "They want you there." Alyssa felt a familiar knot tighten in her chest, fear and resolve tangling together. Being there meant stepping fully into the spotlight the school had tried to dim. It meant risking further scrutiny, further retaliation, but it also meant refusing to let the story end with statements and decorations. In the administrative suite, Whitaker stared at the request form, his reflection faintly visible in the glass table. He understood the stakes now in a way he hadn't before. This wasn't just about public perception. It was about authority being questioned from within. The students weren't waiting for permission anymore. They were demanding consistency. As the meeting dissolved into tense side conversations, Whitaker picked up his phone and stepped into the hallway, away from the screens and consultants. He dialed a number, listening as it rang, his gaze landing on the holiday banner stretched across the corridor. When the call connected, he spoke quietly, urgency threading his voice. "They're organizing," he said. "Students. On campus." He paused, listening to the response, his jaw tightening as the implications settled. The decorations around him shimmered uselessly, symbols of unity masking a fracture that had already formed. Whatever decision came next would not be cosmetic. And for the first time, the pressure wasn't just coming from above or outside, it was rising from the student body itself, demanding something the school had never planned to give. The morning arrived without an announcement. And that was what made it different. No flyers appeared overnight. No mass email tried to shape expectations. Instead, the shift revealed itself in absence. Students entered classrooms and took their seats, backpacks settling to the floor, chairs scraping softly, and then nothing happened. No one opened a notebook. No one raised a hand. When teachers prompted, students looked up politely and said nothing. The silence was not defiant in the way adults expected rebellion to be. It was composed. It was deliberate. It carried the weight of a decision made collectively, without needing a vote. Word spread quickly, though no one could trace its origin. By second period, entire hallways hummed with the same quiet resolve. Students stood in clusters outside classrooms, not chanting, not filming, just standing, arms folded or hands at their sides, eyes forward. A phrase appeared on poster boards and notebook paper, written in marker and pen, taped to lockers and windows. Let her speak. The simplicity cut through everything the administration had tried to complicate. It named the issue without arguing it. It asked for nothing more radical than a voice returned. Alyssa Monroe stood near the edge of the crowd, forming in the main hallway, heart pounding in a way that felt both terrifying and affirming. She hadn't organized this. She hadn't asked for it. And yet, it was unmistakably about her. Students nodded at her as they passed, some offering quiet smiles, others holding her gaze a second longer than usual. She felt the gravity of it settle into her shoulders, not as pressure but as responsibility. The silence wasn't empty. It was speaking for her. Teachers attempted to restore order at first, gently reminding students of expectations, of schedules. The reminders fell flat. There was nothing to discipline, nothing disruptive enough to cite. A math teacher asked if anyone had a question about the assignment, and 30 students stared back calmly, pens unmoving. A substitute threatened detention, then faltered when no one reacted. The silence absorbed authority without confrontation, revealing how much power relied on participation. In the administrative suite, confusion hardened into alarm. Reports arrived in fragments, classrooms stalled, hallways filling, students refusing to engage without breaking rules. The assistant principal described it as passive resistance, her voice tight. Whitaker stood by the window again, watching the gathering below, the phrase on the signs repeating like a refrain. He recognized the danger immediately. This wasn't chaos. This was coherence, and coherence was harder to dismantle. An unexpected development deepened the impact. Teachers began joining the silence. Not all of them, not openly, but enough to matter. A veteran history teacher closed her textbook and sat at her desk, hands folded, eyes on the students. A science teacher allowed the class to remain quiet without marking attendance. The gesture was subtle, plausible as indecision, but students felt it as permission. The generational shift was no longer theoretical. It was embodied in rooms where authority chose restraint over enforcement. The administration called an emergency assembly, then canceled it minutes later, fearing the optics. Security hovered near entrances, unsure what they were meant to prevent. Parents began arriving, alerted by texts and social feeds, finding a school that looked calm and felt charged. They asked questions at the front desk, and received practiced responses that didn't land. The silence had made explanations obsolete. Alyssa was called to the counselor's office again, this time with urgency. The counselor spoke quickly about safety, about escalation, about the need to de-escalate emotions. Alyssa listened, then asked quietly why her speech couldn't be read now, if the concern had always been timing. The counselor faltered, words rearranging themselves without substance. Alyssa thanked her and stood, the answer already clear. In the hallway, Marcus Hale stood beside a column, phone in his pocket heavier than ever. He watched administrators move past with forced calm, watched students hold their ground without saying a word. He understood then that the recording he had made was no longer just evidence. It was a lever, but levers required timing. He waited, heart racing, as the silence continued to speak louder than any clip could. At noon, the student-led forum request resurfaced, now backed by hundreds of signatures collected in less than an hour. The language was sharper this time, less deferential. It referenced the school's stated values, and asked directly for Alyssa to be allowed to address the student body. The phrase "let her speak" appeared again at the bottom, signed simply, "The student." Whitaker convened his inner circle, the room tense with competing urgencies. Legal counsel warned about liability. Communications urged swift resolution. District representatives cautioned against precedent. The arguments collided without landing. At the center sat the truth no one wanted to say aloud. Denying the request now would confirm everything the silence accused them of. Granting it would unravel the authority they'd worked to protect. Outside the office, the silence held. Students sat on the floor of the hallway now, backs against lockers, signs resting on knees. No chants, no shouts, just presence. Alyssa moved through them slowly, careful not to center herself, yet unable to avoid the way the crowd shifted to make space. Someone pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand. It wasn't a message, just the opening line of her speech, handwritten, copied with care. A teacher approached Whitaker as he stepped into the corridor. Voice low but steady. She said the students weren't going anywhere, that forcing the issue would only deepen the fracture. She added, almost as an aside, that this was the most civics-minded behavior she'd seen in decades of teaching. Whitaker nodded without responding, the comment landing heavier than accusation. The unexpected twist came when a district official suggested a compromise. Allow a moderated statement. Read by an administrator. Excerpted and approved. The suggestion revealed the fear beneath the process. The need to control even the act of restoration. Whitaker considered it for half a second before realizing it would fail. The silence wasn't asking for a summary. It was asking for authenticity. Marcus's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number again. If they don't let her speak, release it. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. The threat existed without articulation, hovering at the edge of the room like a storm cloud. Everyone could see. As the afternoon wore on, the cost became clearer. Board members called. Donors asked questions. Teachers hinted at statements. The school's leadership faced a narrowing path. Whitaker returned to his office, closed the door, and sat heavily in his chair. On his desk lay the request form, the signatures, the printed screenshots of posts he wished he could erase. He knew the decision waiting on him wouldn't just shape the day, it would define his tenure. Outside, the silence finally shifted, not into noise, but into expectation. Students stood as one, signs lifted slightly higher. Alyssa felt the room lean toward a moment that could not be postponed. Somewhere down the hall, a door opened. Footsteps approached, and with them came the weight of a choice that could end careers, redraw authority, and decide whether the school would cling to control, or finally let her speak. The decision came down without ceremony, delivered in the clipped language of logistics. The forum would be allowed, but only under controlled conditions. The phrase traveled quickly through the building, hollow and ominous, and by the time students gathered near the auditorium, the meaning had already materialized at the doors. Two uniformed security officers stood where ushers usually smiled during assemblies, their presence out of place against the paper garlands taped along the walls. Radios crackled softly at their shoulders. The holiday banners sagged above them, a cheerful lie stretched thin. Alyssa Monroe arrived with her parents just as the crowd began to swell. The hallway narrowed with bodies and anticipation. Students pressing in from every direction, faces tight with a mix of resolve and unease. When Alyssa stepped forward, the officers shifted subtly, a half step that didn't block her but didn't invite her either. One lifted a hand, palm outward, a gesture meant to be neutral, but loaded with implication. Alyssa paused, confusion flickering across her face. "Name?" the officer asked, voice steady, eyes already scanning. "My daughter," her mother said. The words clipped. "Protective." Alyssa answered anyway, her name sounding strange in her own ears, as if it were being introduced to suspicion for the first time. The officer glanced at a clipboard, then at his partner. The exchange was silent, practice. The delay was unnecessary. That was the point. Behind Alyssa, students murmured, the sound rising like pressure in a sealed room. Someone whispered, "Are you serious?" Another voice cut through. Sharper, "She's a student." The officers didn't respond. They asked Alyssa to step aside. Just briefly, they said, "Procedure. Safety." The language of neutrality returned, deployed to justify the extraordinary. Alyssa stepped where they indicated, heart pounding, the weight of eyes settling on her shoulders. She felt suddenly hypervisible, every movement scrutinized. A teacher approached, concern etched into her face, asking if everything was okay. The officer answered before Alyssa could, explaining they needed to verify access. The teacher hesitated, then nodded, complicit without intending to be. Alyssa watched the moment lodge itself into memory, the ease with which authority redirected concern away from her. Her father leaned in, voice low. "What's going on?" he asked. "Just a moment," the officer repeated, already turning away. The moment stretched. Inside the administrative suite, Whitaker watched the scene unfold on a security monitor, jaw set. He told himself this was precaution, that large gatherings required oversight, that recent events justified vigilance. He avoided the word threat, though it hovered close, uninvited but persistent. He reminded himself that he had allowed the assembly, that compromise demanded boundaries. Still, something about the image, Alyssa standing apart, flanked by uniforms beneath tinsel, gnawed at him. The unexpected escalation rippled outward. Students noticed immediately. Phones came out. Not to provoke, but to document. A senior asked loudly why security was needed. Now when pep rallies packed the same space without incident. Another pointed to the decorations. The absurdity of armed presence beneath paper snowflakes. The officers shifted again. Hands near belts. Eyes moving. The posture alone communicated mistrust. Alyssa's mother stepped forward, voice steady but edged. "If you're looking for someone dangerous," she said, "you're standing in the wrong place." The officer met her gaze, discomfort flickering, but protocol held. He asked Alyssa to open her bag. The request landed like an accusation. Alyssa complied, hands shaking as she unzipped the pocket and held it open. Inside were notebooks, pens, the folded pages of her speech. Nothing else. A murmur rolled through the hallway. Anger this time, less restrained. A student laughed sharply, disbelief cracking the sound. Another called out, "Is this what you think safety looks like?" A teacher raised her voice, telling students to lower their phones. No one listened. The moment had crossed from control into spectacle. Marcus Hale stood a few rows back, phone heavy in his pocket again, watching the calculus change. He hadn't planned for this, hadn't anticipated how quickly the school would revert to suspicion once pressed. The recording he held felt suddenly insufficient and essential all at once. He thought of Whitaker's sentence, of fear masquerading as foresight. He understood now that escalation didn't require violence. It required implication. After a beat too long, the officer nodded and stepped aside. "You can go in," he said, as if granting permission were a kindness. Alyssa moved forward, the crowd parting, her parents flanking her like anchors. The hallway breathed again, but the air had changed. What had been a demand for voice had been recast, briefly and publicly, as a security concern. The message was unmistakable. Inside the auditorium, the lights were dimmed to assembly levels, the stage bare, except for a single microphone placed dead center. It looked smaller than Alyssa remembered. Exposed, security took positions along the walls, their silhouettes cutting into the glow of exit signs. The front rows filled quickly, students sitting on the floor when seats ran out, backs straight, eyes forward. Teachers lined the sides, expressions tight, no music played. The silence returned, heavier now. Whitaker stood near the stage, conferring with district representatives who had arrived quietly, their presence another layer of pressure. He scanned the room, noting the phones, the signs folded under chairs, the posture of the crowd. This was not the compliant audience he was used to. This was an audience waiting. Alyssa took a seat near the aisle, the folded speech resting in her lap, like a weight she had carried too long. She felt the echo of the hallway moment vibrating through her chest, the humiliation sharpened by the fact that it had been witnessed. She breathed slowly, grounding herself in the familiar rhythm she used before performances. The words were still hers. They hadn't taken that. A staff member approached her, whispering about guidelines, time limits, reminders to stay on topic, suggestions to avoid language that could be misinterpreted. Alyssa nodded without committing. She looked past the staff member to the microphone, to the students whose eyes didn't waver. The reassurance she found there steadied her more than any instruction could. In the back row, Marcus slipped his phone from his pocket and opened the recording again, thumb hovering over the share icon. He hadn't shared it yet, but the hallway scene had recalibrated his sense of risk. If they were willing to frame Alyssa as a problem before letting her speak, what would they do once she did? The question pressed hard. Whitaker stepped to the podium, clearing his throat. The murmur quieted. He began with language about safety, about ensuring a respectful environment. The words skimmed the surface, failing to land. He gestured toward the microphone, toward Alyssa, as if the gesture alone could undo what had already been seen. Security remained at the doors, arms crossed, eyes scanning. The contrast was stark. A student asked to speak about belonging under watch, as if she might break something simply by existing too fully. The hypocrisy settled into the room like a fog. As Whitaker finished his brief introduction, a hush fell so complete, it felt engineered. Alyssa stood. The sound of her chair sliding back cut through the silence, sharp and final. She stepped into the aisle, the weight of the moment pulling every gaze toward her. Somewhere behind her, a radio crackled once, then went still. The microphone waited, live and unforgiving. Alyssa reached the edge of the stage, climbed the steps and placed her pages on the stand with deliberate care. She looked out at the room, at the students, the teachers, the administrators, the security stationed like punctuation marks around the edges of the truth. The assembly had begun, but nothing about it felt ordinary. The air vibrated with consequence, the kind that didn't dissipate once words were spoken. Alyssa lifted her eyes to the audience, drew a breath, and in that suspended second before sound, everyone understood that whatever came next would either expose the school completely or force it to finally listen. Alyssa Monroe stood at the microphone long enough for the room to feel the weight. The quiet was no longer passive. It pressed outward, demanding release. She didn't rush to fill it. She looked across the auditorium slowly, letting her gaze rest on faces she recognized, and faces she didn't, on teachers who had taught her to write, and administrators who had taught her restraint. Security remained along the walls, unmoving, their presence a reminder of the miscalculation that had already been made. The microphone hummed faintly, alive this time, impossible to silence without consequence. When Alyssa finally spoke, her voice did not tremble. It wasn't loud, but it carried, shaped by years of learning how to be heard without giving anyone an excuse to dismiss her. She began where she had always planned to begin, with gratitude, not as performance but as grounding. She thanked the choir, the organizers, the classmates who had decorated the hallways, the teachers who had made the season feel like more than a countdown to break. The familiarity lulled some studious into expectation, into the belief that this would be safe after all. Whitaker shifted slightly near the aisle, his shoulders loosening by a fraction. Then Alyssa pivoted, gently, deliberately. She spoke about Christmas as a season of recognition, about how it asked people to see one another beyond roles and routines. Her words were measured, but they carried weight, each sentence placed with care. She described belonging, not as a gift bestowed by institutions, but as something built through daily acts of attention. Students leaned forward, teachers stopped scanning the room, phones, already raised, steady. She did not accuse. She did not name names. Instead, she described moments, walking through hallways, and feeling watched, sitting in classrooms, and feeling invisible, being praised for excellence, while warned not to disrupt. The language was plain enough to be undeniable. The room responded not with murmurs, but with stillness, the kind that signals recognition. Alyssa could feel it, the way the audience met her words halfway, the way they filled the spaces she left intentionally open. Whitaker's attention sharpened. This wasn't incendiary. It was worse. It was reasonable. He scanned the security officers, then the exits, calculating reactions that weren't coming. The speech was dismantling the narrative he had relied on, not by confrontation but by clarity. Every line made the earlier decision harder to defend. Alyssa spoke about care, about how schools taught students to think critically, while sometimes fearing what critical thinking revealed. She spoke about how silence could be mistaken for harmony, how quiet compliance could be mistaken for comfort. A teacher in the third row felt her throat tighten, recognizing herself in the description of gentle deflection, of redirecting hard questions toward easier ground. She folded her hands and listened. The emotional release arrived in waves, not a single crescendo. A laugh here, soft and surprised, when Alyssa described how students learned to decode feedback that wasn't meant to be heard literally. A sigh there, collective, when she named the exhaustion of being told to wait for the right time. The room breathed together, the shared rhythm dissolving the barriers that had been erected to manage it. Then Alyssa reached the part she had almost cut, the paragraph that had worried her most, the one she had reread the night before with a steadying hand on the page. She slowed, eyes lifting from the paper, trusting memory now. She spoke about what it felt like to be asked to celebrate while being told implicitly that parts of her experience were inconvenient. She spoke about the harm of being managed rather than heard, of being framed as potential trouble rather than present truth. In the back row, Marcus Hale felt the recording in his pocket grow suddenly irrelevant. The proof he had carried, seemed small beside the proof unfolding in front of him. The speech was doing what evidence alone couldn't. It was moving people beyond defense into recognition. He watched administrators exchange glances, watched students nod, watched the room tilt towards something irreversible. Alyssa's voice held as she acknowledged fear, not her own, but the fear that shaped decisions made about her. She didn't accuse anyone of malice. She named fear as a force that narrowed choices, that turned care into control. The line landed hard. Whitaker's jaw tightened. The district representative shifted in his seat. Fear had been named without permission. The unexpected twist came not from Alyssa, but from the room. A teacher stood quietly near the aisle. Then another. Then another. Not in protest but in recognition. They did not clap. They did not interrupt. They simply stood. A silent acknowledgement that the speech had reached beyond students. The gesture rippled, subtle but unmistakable. Whitaker felt the floor shift beneath the institution he represented. Alyssa continued, now speaking about responsibility, hers and theirs. She said she believed in the school's stated values, that she had written her speech because she trusted the space to hold truth without punishment. The admission cut deeper than anger would have. It reframed the earlier action as a breach of trust rather than a procedural choice. The language of policy shrank under the language of principle. Phones across the room captured it all. Live streams steady, comments scrolling faster than anyone could read. The story was no longer being told about Alyssa. It was being told through her. Outside the building, people watched in real time. Parents at work, alumni in other states, students from other schools, drawn by the clarity of a young voice that refused to perform outrage while naming harm precisely. Whitaker took a step forward, then stopped. Interruption now would confirm everything the speech implied. He had no acceptable move left. The microphone was live. The audience aligned. The moment he felt the career calculus click into place, a cold awareness settling that this would not end quietly. Alyssa reached the final page, hands steady. She spoke about hope, not as consolation, but as commitment. She said hope required action, required listening even when it was uncomfortable, required trusting students with their own voices. The room leaned in, breath held. This was the ending they expected, the uplift that would allow applause and closure. But Alyssa didn't stop there. She paused, eyes lifting again, scanning the room one last time. The pause stretched, the air tightening. She spoke again, and the line that followed cut through every calculation that had preceded it. She said that the first time she had tried to speak these words, her microphone had gone silent. Not because the equipment failed, but because the institution did. She said she understood now that the interruption hadn't been about timing or tone, but about fear of what honesty might demand. She said that what hurt most wasn't the silence itself, but the way it had been justified. The room froze. Whitaker's face drained of color. The district representative's pen stopped mid-note. Security officers shifted, uncertain too late. Alyssa had named the moment they had tried to erase, and in doing so she exposed the full arc of the decision-making that had followed. The speech was no longer abstract. It was an indictment delivered without accusation. A mirror held steady. A murmur rose. Not applause, not protest, something deeper, a collective intake of breath, as recognition solidified into resolve. The live stream comments exploded. The line spread instantly, clipped and shared, stripped of nothing because nothing needed stripping. Alyssa stood at the microphone, the last sentence hanging between her and the audience like a bridge no one could dismantle. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't strayed from her page. She had simply said what had happened, in the place it had happened, while the world watched. The administrators understood in the same moment that the school's exposure was complete. There would be statements, investigations, consequences that could not be managed away. Careers would be measured against this pause, this line, this refusal to let silence stand as explanation. Alyssa closed her folder gently, the sound sharp in the quiet that followed. She looked out once more, meeting the eyes of students who had carried her to this moment, and adults who now had to meet it. The applause hadn't started yet. The room was suspended, caught between response and reckoning, and in that suspended second, before sound returned, everyone understood that what she had just said could not be unheard, and that the next moment would decide whether the institution would finally answer for it. The applause arrived late, as if the room needed permission to exhale. When it did, it wasn't explosive. It built in layers, hands coming together cautiously at first, then with conviction, then with a force that filled the auditorium and spilled into the hallways. Alyssa Monroe stood still as it rose around her, the sound washing over a body that had already given everything it had to give. She didn't bow. She didn't smile. She simply nodded once, a small acknowledgement that felt truer than any gesture of triumph. The applause wasn't for performance, it was for recognition. Whitaker didn't clap at first. He stood frozen near the aisle, the words Alyssa had spoken replaying with brutal clarity. The line about the microphone, about institutional failure, had landed exactly where it was never meant to land. In public, in real time, without the buffer of memos or moderated language. When he finally brought his hands together, the sound felt hollow even to him. He knew the moment had escaped him. Applause had shifted the axis of power, and it wouldn't shift back quietly. Phones were still raised as the clapping tapered into murmurs, then conversations that ignited instantly. Students turned to one another with eyes bright and wet, whispering variations of the same thing. Did you hear that? Teachers looked around, gauging reactions, calculating what their silence or support would now mean. Security officers eased their stance, uncertain what role remained for them once the perceived threat had spoken and been heard. Alyssa stepped away from the microphone and descended the stage steps slowly. Her parents met her halfway, their faces composed, but taut with emotion held just beneath the surface. Her mother's hand found hers, grounding, steady. Alyssa felt the tremor in her own fingers, then not fear, but release. The room had carried her. Now it was letting her go. Backstage, administrators gathered in a tight cluster, voices low and urgent. The district representative spoke first, his tone clipped. He referenced protocol, exposure, next steps. Someone suggested issuing a statement immediately to frame the moment. The suggestion earned a look that said framing had ended the moment. Alyssa named the silence. Whitaker listened, saying little, his mind racing ahead to emails, to calls, to a calendar suddenly rewritten by consequence.
Outside the auditorium.
The story multiplied. Clips from the live stream were already circulating, edited not to provoke but to clarify. Alyssa's words traveled intact, context preserved by the sheer volume of witnesses. Headlines followed within minutes, careful at first, then bolder as confirmation poured in. The phrase "microphone went silent" became shorthand for something larger, a symbol that commentators didn't need to explain. By evening, the school's voicemail overflowed. Parents demanded meetings. Alumni offered support. Advocacy groups requested statements. The district office issued a notice announcing a formal review. The language precise and non-committal. Whitaker read it twice, recognizing the distance embedded in the phrasing. Review meant investigation. Investigation meant time. Time meant scrutiny that would not be easily survived. Teachers convened informally after hours, some in classrooms, some in parking lots, processing what had happened. A few admitted aloud that they had suspected the decision to stop the speech was wrong but had trusted leadership to handle it. Others said less, faces tight with the knowledge that inaction had also been an action. The moral reckoning wasn't uniform, but it was unavoidable. Alyssa's words had rearranged the map. Students gathered online that night, not to celebrate but to organize. They discussed demands carefully, wary of overreach but unwilling to retreat. Accountability rose to the center of the conversation, not punishment for its own sake, but acknowledgement. They wanted answers. They wanted assurances that what had happened wouldn't be managed away. They wanted the school to say plainly what it had done and why. Marcus Hale sat at his desk watching the momentum build, the recording still untouched. He realized, with a strange mix of relief and unease, that he might not need it anymore. The truth had arrived without it. Still, the existence of the recording mattered. It hovered like a backstop against revision, a reminder that evidence did not vanish just because the narrative changed. He saved it to a secure folder and closed his laptop, understanding that restraint now was also a choice. Whitaker returned to his office, long after the building emptied. The decorations glowed faintly under after-hours lighting, their cheer now bordering on mockery. He sat at his desk and opened his email, scrolling through messages he couldn't yet answer. One from the superintendent stood out, brief, direct, requesting a meeting the next morning. No reassurance followed, no language of support. Whitaker leaned back, the chair creaking softly, and stared at the ceiling. He thought about the decisions that had seemed so reasonable at the time. The email, the interruption, the justifications that shifted depending on the listener. Each had been made to preserve stability. Each had done the opposite. The institution he had tried to protect now faced questions it had never planned to answer, and at the center of those questions sat his name. At home, Alyssa lay awake, exhaustion settling into her bones. Messages continued to arrive, but she set the phone aside, choosing stillness over response. She replayed the speech in her mind. Not the applause, but the pause before it. The moment when she had named what happened, and felt the room hold its breath. That moment felt heavier than any ovation. It was where the truth had lodged. Her parents spoke quietly in the kitchen, discussing next steps, legal options, media requests. Alyssa listened from her room, comforted by the murmur without needing to join it. For the first time since the microphone had gone silent days earlier, she felt something close to peace, not resolution, not safety, but alignment. She had said what needed to be said. The next morning, news vans lined the street outside the school. Students arrived to a building already under watch. Cameras trained on the entrance. The administration moved through the day with rehearsed calm, but the tension was visible in every clipped exchange. The district announced an independent review, effective immediately. Whitaker was placed on administrative leave pending its outcome. The phrasing was neutral. The implication was not. When the announcement filtered through the hallways, reactions were mixed. Relief, shock, uncertainty. No one cheered. The moment was too complex for that. Accountability carried weight, and weight sobered celebration. Alyssa heard the news from a friend who found her near the windows, voice hushed. Alyssa nodded, absorbing it without satisfaction. The story wasn't over. Consequences rarely ended neatly. In the administrative suite, Whitaker packed his briefcase slowly, removing personal items with care. A colleague lingered at the door, offering a look that blended sympathy and distance. Whitaker accepted it without comment. As he turned off the light, he glanced once more at the desk where decisions had been framed as prudence and executed as silence. He understood now that fear had guided him more than he'd admitted. Outside, students gathered again, not in protest, not in silence, but in conversation. The school stood at an inflection point, its future no longer abstract. Policies would change, statements would be issued, but trust, once fractured, demanded more than procedure to repair. As Alyssa walked past the front office, she caught sight of the empty chair behind the desk where Whitaker had once sat. The absence felt provisional, unresolved. The investigation loomed, outcomes uncertain. Careers, reputations, and the school's identity itself hung in the balance. And as the doors closed behind her, Alyssa understood that while the applause had faded, the reckoning had only just begun, and the question of who would ultimately answer for the silence remained dangerously open. The statements came first, polished and punctual, released within hours of the administrative leave announcement, as if the institution had been rehearsing for this moment. They spoke of commitment to equity, of learning opportunities, of the importance of student voice. The language was careful, almost tender, and it moved swiftly across inboxes and feeds, asking for patience while processes unfolded. To an outsider, it sounded like accountability. Inside the building, it felt like a closing door. By midday, the first consequences appeared. Not where the public expected, but where power often redirected pressure. A brief notice circulated, announcing disciplinary action against several students for unauthorized recording and disruption of instructional time. Names were not listed publicly, but everyone knew. Marcus Hale was called to the office during fourth period, and returned pale, his backpack heavier with paperwork than books. He didn't speak about the meeting, but the rumor filled in the blanks faster than truth ever could. The unevenness was immediate and unmistakable. Administrators emphasized policy adherence, explaining that rules existed regardless of intent. The explanation landed differently now, stripped of moral authority by the week's events. Students compared notes and noticed patterns, warnings for some, suspensions for others, leniency offered quietly, where connections existed. The image management had shifted targets. With leadership under scrutiny, control moved downward. Alyssa Monroe learned about the suspensions from a text that arrived without context. Just a screenshot of a notice and a single line beneath it. "They're punishing people." The words hit harder than she expected. The silence she had broken had returned, repurposed as discipline. She felt the old calculation surface. How far was too far? Who would be protected? Who would be exposed once the cameras turned away? In classrooms, teachers spoke less about the situation and more about procedure. They reminded students of phone policies, of appropriate channels, of consequences. The reminders sounded neutral, but felt corrective. a recalibration designed to restore hierarchy. Alyssa watched as a classmate was asked to step into the hallway for asking a question, framed too sharply. The message was subtle and effective. Speak, but only within bounds that preserved Parents responded unevenly, as well. Some accepted the statements at face value, relieved to see order reasserted. Others bristled, recognizing retaliation dressed as governance. Alyssa's parents received calls from families they barely knew, asking what could be done, offering support, whispering about legal options without committing to them. Fear had not disappeared. It had changed shape. An unexpected twist surfaced when a local outlet reported on the suspensions, framing them as fallout rather than enforcement. The piece quoted policy language and juxtaposed it with footage from the assembly. The contrast stark. Comments flooded in, questioning why accountability traveled towards students rather than decisions. The district issued a clarification, emphasizing that the review was ongoing and that disciplinary actions were separate matters. The separation convinced few. Marcus sat at home that evening, phone face down, replaying the meeting in his head. He had been told that recording without consent violated policy. That intention didn't negate infraction. The irony was not lost on him. He thought of the words spoken about perception and impact. The same logic now turned against him. He considered deleting the recording. He didn't. He backed it up. Alyssa met Marcus briefly after school near the library. Their conversation hushed but direct. He told her what had happened, not asking for absolution, just stating facts. Alyssa listened, the weight of responsibility settling again, heavier now because it had moved beyond her. She apologized instinctively, then stopped herself, recognizing the reflex. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said, the certainty in her voice surprising them both. The administration continued to project calm. A town hall was scheduled, moderated, questions pre-submitted. The format promised transparency. While limiting unpredictability, students debated whether to attend, whether participation legitimized the process. Some teachers encouraged engagement, others advised caution. The institution had learned to manage optics quickly. What it hadn't learned was how to absorb truth without deflecting it. Then the final revelation surfaced. Quiet at first, then impossible to contain. A parent obtained records through a routine request, emails and internal notes released under policy timelines that no one had thought to delay. Among them was a thread predating the assembly by days, not hours, discussing risk scenarios, donor reactions, and containment strategies. One line stood out, clinical and cold. If student insists on speaking, we may need to consider disciplinary pathways post-event. The implication landed like a verdict. The silence, the security, the suspensions, they were no longer separate decisions. They were a sequence. The parent shared the documents with counsel before sharing them publicly. A detail that mattered. When the story broke, it did so with legal gravity, not outrage alone. Whitaker's name appeared again, contextualized, now within planning rather than panic. The district moved swiftly, announcing an expansion of the review. Statements were revised, then revised again. The language grew thinner with each iteration, trust evaporating as precision increased. The school's attempt to regain narrative control collided with a paper trail that refused to be managed. Alyssa read the documents late at night, sitting at the same desk where she had once rehearsed a speech meant to bring people together. The words on the screen felt heavier than applause ever had. They confirmed what she had sensed but hadn't been able to prove, that the harm was not accidental, that fear had been operationalized. She closed the laptop and sat still, letting the clarity settle. Her parents spoke quietly about next steps, their voices measured. They didn't rush to action. They understood the cost of escalation, the scrutiny it invited. But the question had changed. It was no longer whether the school had made a mistake. It was whether the mistake had been planned. At school the next day, students moved carefully, aware that the ground was shifting again. Some avoided eye contact with administrators. Others watched closely, measuring responses. Marcus returned after his suspension ended, welcomed by nods and silence that felt protective rather than isolating. The cost had been real, but it had not broken him. As evening fell, a brief email arrived in Alyssa's inbox from an unfamiliar address, formal and precise. It acknowledged receipt of materials, referenced potential claims, and requested a meeting. The tone was calm, almost reassuring. Alyssa read it twice, recognizing the threshold it represented. She closed her eyes, thinking of the microphone, the silence, the applause that followed. The institution had spoken. The students had spoken. Now another voice was entering the room, one that spoke in filings and findings, not assemblies. And as Alyssa forwarded the message to her parents and set her phone down, she understood that the price of speaking up was still being calculated, and that the final account might be settled in a place the school could not decorate or control. The days that followed did not feel like resolution. They felt like aftershocks, quiet, uneven, impossible to map all at once. The school reopened after winter break, with decorations still hanging, now dulled by time and memory. The banner over the hallway had been taken down, replaced by a neutral welcome sign that said nothing about joy or unity. Students noticed the absence immediately. Symbols once weaponized by comfort had become liabilities. Alyssa Monroe returned to campus without announcement. No escort, no spotlight, just a steady walk through doors that no longer swallowed her whole. Teachers greeted her carefully, some with warmth, some with restraint, all aware that the balance had shifted. The administration had changed faces at the top, but the structure remained, cautious and alert. Policies were being rewritten in committee rooms, language was being scrubbed and softened. The institution was learning, slowly, how to speak again without flinching. The investigation moved forward in increments, measured and procedural. Findings were not shared publicly, but outcomes appeared in pieces. Reassignments, resignations framed as personal decisions, training sessions scheduled and rescheduled. The school issued another statement, this one longer, more detailed, acknowledging systemic failures in judgment. It named harm without naming authors. It promised reforms without timelines. The statement satisfied some and angered others. It did not satisfy Alyssa. She sat in class and listened as lessons resumed, the normal rhythms returning without fully covering what had happened. Students whispered less now, but they watched more. They noticed whose voices were invited and whose were deferred. They noticed how meetings were facilitated, how listening was practiced. The speech had not fixed the school. It had changed the way the school could lie to itself. Marcus Hale passed Alyssa in the hallway one afternoon and nodded, the same gesture from earlier now carrying a different weight. He had returned quieter, not diminished but recalibrated. The suspension had taught him what consequences looked like when truth traveled faster than permission. He had chosen not to release the recording, not because it wasn't needed, but because the speech had already done something rarer. It had shifted conscience without forcing spectacle. The recording remained, archived, a reminder that some evidence existed simply to prevent revision. Parents continued to gather in smaller rooms now, no longer shouting but asking sharper questions. Some demanded curriculum changes. Others asked about hiring practices, about how decisions were reviewed when donors called. The school responded with committees and listening sessions, its favorite tools. This time, students were invited not as symbols but as participants. The invitation mattered, even if it did not guarantee change. Alyssa was asked to join one of those sessions. She declined politely. Her refusal was not anger. It was boundary. She had already given her words. She would not be used to authenticate a process that might outpace accountability. Her parents supported the choice, understanding that courage did not require constant availability. Outside the school, the story settled into something less volatile and more enduring. Other students shared their experiences, inspired not by outrage, but by recognition. They wrote essays, spoke at meetings, named moments they had once swallowed. Some stories gained traction, others didn't. The pattern was familiar, and that familiarity was part of the lesson. Change did not arrive evenly. It arrived through pressure and patience, through moments that cracked open enough space for the next voice to step forward. On the last day before spring break, Alyssa passed the auditorium again. The doors were open, lights dimmed, chairs stacked for cleaning. The microphone stand remained center stage, ordinary and unremarkable. She stepped inside alone, and stood where she had stood before, listening to the quiet. It felt different now, not empty, not threatening, just space. She imagined all the voices that had passed through this room, and all the ones that hadn't been allowed to. The thought did not make her bitter. It made her careful. She had learned that courage did not always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looked like refusal. Sometimes it looked like clarity delivered without permission. Her speech had not been revolutionary in content. That was the truth that lingered. It had been dangerous only because it was gentle and precise. Because it asked people to see themselves in ways they could not dismiss as extreme. The school would continue. It always did. New banners would go up. New assemblies would be scheduled. Administrators would come and go. Policies would be updated. then tested by the next uncomfortable truth. Alyssa understood that permanence was not promised. Impact was. As she left the auditorium, she paused once more at the doorway and looked back, not with longing, but with acknowledgement. The speech had changed the school, yes, but not because it had fixed it. It had changed the terms. Silence could no longer pretend to be neutrality. Control could no longer hide behind care without being questioned. Students had learned that their presence mattered even when authority bristled. Outside, the campus hummed with ordinary life. Laughter, arguments, futures unfolding without guarantees. Alyssa blended into it. Not erased, not elevated, just present. She carried with her the knowledge that speaking had cost something, and given something in return. She did not mistake one for the other. That night, as the lights went out across the building, the microphone stood unused, waiting for the next moment it would be asked to carry truth. Somewhere beyond the school, another student rehearsed words they were not sure they would be allowed to say. Somewhere else, an institution weighed comfort against honesty, hoping to choose correctly this time. And in the quiet that followed, the question remained, not as accusation, but as invitation. How many voices had learned to be silent before this one was finally heard? And how many were still waiting for a room brave enough to listen? If this story made you uncomfortable, it means it mattered. Type yes in the comments if you believe no student should ever be silenced for telling the truth, and tell us what would you have done if you were in that room. Subscribe to this channel to keep these stories alive, because silence protects injustice, but attention changes outcomes. We don't share these stories to shock you. We share them so the next voice isn't erased.